They say a person's worth isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the love they give and the respect they command. For 62 years, I believed that. I believed that my value as a mother was etched into the very bones of my children, a silent, unbreakable contract of mutual devotion built on decades of my own sacrifice. But a contract is only valid if both parties honor it. When one side starts treating it like a disposable napkin, you learn that sometimes, your worth must be calculated, itemized, and presented on a legally binding invoice. My story isn't about the sting of a thoughtless gift, it's about the moment the thoughtlessness becomes a pattern, a clear and undeniable statement of your perceived value in the world your children have built for themselves, a world you funded. It's about a cheap, plastic keychain that cost me my illusions and bought me my freedom. This is the story of how I stopped being a mother and became a proprietor, and how I finally collected on a debt that had been accruing for 35 years. If you've ever felt overlooked, taken for granted, or invisible in your own family, then you know the quiet ache I'm talking about. Stick with me, and I'll tell you exactly how I turned that ache into action. And while you're here, please consider subscribing to the channel and ringing that bell, because stories like these are a reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the one with the most power. I want to hear your stories too, so leave a comment below, and tell me about a time you had to stand up for your own worth. It began, as so many family tragedies do, on a holiday designed to celebrate the very thing it was about to shatter, Mother's Day. We were at a restaurant far too loud and trendy for my taste, the kind of place with exposed brick and Edison bulbs where the menu is written on a chalkboard and a single scallop costs $30. It was my son Daniel's choice, of course. Everything in our lives had become Daniel's choice. He sat across from me, beaming, next to his perfectly coiffed wife, Chloe. Next to them sat Chloe's mother, Barbara, a woman who looked like she was perpetually auditioning for a role in a luxury car commercial. I was just me. Eleanor, his mother. The woman in the sensible cardigan who still cut coupons, not out of necessity anymore, but out of a habit forged in the lean years. The years I'd paid for the education that allowed him to afford this $30 scallop. We exchanged pleasantries, the conversation flowing around me like a river around a stone. They talked about their upcoming trip to Aspen, the new Peloton Chloe was obsessed with, the quarterly profits from Daniel's graphic design firm, the firm I'd helped him start with the last of my husband's life insurance. I smiled and nodded, the designated audience for their success. Then came the gifts. Daniel cleared his throat, a theatrical gesture he'd picked up from watching too many corporate presentations. He turned first to Barbara. He presented her with a large, elegant box from a designer whose name I only knew from the glossy magazines Chloe left behind when she visited. Inside was a leather handbag, the color of rich cream. Barbara gasped, a performance of surprised delight. She ran her hands over it, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Oh, Daniel, Chloe, you shouldn't have," she cried. "It's just too much." But her eyes said it was exactly the right amount. As a follow-up, Chloe handed her an envelope. "And a weekend spa retreat for two," she announced. "So you can take a friend and really relax. You deserve it, Mom." Barbara was practically levitating with joy. There were hugs, air kisses, and promises of eternal gratitude. The whole table basked in the warm glow of their generosity. Then, Daniel turned to me. The energy shifted immediately. The grandiosity vanished, replaced by a sort of dutiful, perfunctory affection. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, lumpy object. It was a keychain. Not a nice, sterling silver one. It was a thick, acrylic rectangle with a cheap metal ring. Encased in the plastic were little floating hearts and the words, printed in a cloying, childish font, "World's Best Mom." He placed it on the table in front of me. It landed with a dull clack that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," he said, his smile a little too tight. "We saw this and thought of you, I looked at the keychain. I looked at Barbara's designer handbag, which was probably worth more than my monthly mortgage payment had ever been. I looked at the gift certificate for the spa, a place I couldn't even imagine setting foot in. Then I looked back at the keychain. It was the kind of thing you buy from a gas station on the way to a forgotten obligation. It was an afterthought. It wasn't a gift, it was a proof of purchase, evidence that a transaction labeled Mother's Day had, technically, been completed. I felt a cold wave wash over me, so profound it was almost dizzying. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a terrifying, clarifying sort of calm. It was the calm of a scientist looking at a slide under a microscope and finally seeing the disease in its purest form. In that moment, watching Chloe smugly pat her mother's hand and Daniel look at me with that expectant, "Aren't you going to say thank you" expression, I saw everything with perfect, brutal clarity. I was not his mother. I was his origin story. I was a chapter he had finished reading and now felt vaguely obligated to keep on his shelf. Barbara was his present. She represented the status and the life he was building. I represented the debt and the past he had transcended. And the value of that debt, in his eyes, was a $5 piece of plastic. I picked it up. The plastic felt slick and cheap in my hand. I summoned a smile from a place of deep, ancestral female resilience, the same place I found it when the doctor told me my husband, Robert, wasn't going to make it. "Thank you, Daniel," I said, my voice even. "It's very practical." The word hung in the air, sharp and pointed, but he was too pleased with himself to notice. He just nodded, relieved that the duty was done, and turned his attention back to his phone, probably checking the stock market, or his company's social media feed. In that moment, staring at the garish little trinket in my palm, I didn't just feel hurt. I felt a sense of resolve crystallizing in my veins. The contract was broken. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was time to issue a final invoice. My son wasn't just entitled. He was blind. And I was about to be the one to restore his sight. The next day, the phone rang. It was Daniel, his voice syrupy with the false bonhomie he adopted when he suspected he might be in some minor trouble. "Hey Mom, just calling to check in," he began. "Did you have a nice rest of your day yesterday?" I was in my kitchen, staring at the keychain that I'd placed on the counter. It seemed to absorb all the light in the room. It was a tiny black hole of disrespect. "It was quiet, Daniel," I replied, my voice flat. There was a pause. He was waiting for me to gush, to tell him how much his token meant to me, to validate the minimal effort he had expended. When I offered nothing, he barreled on, a little too quickly. "So, listen, Chloe and I were talking, and we just wanted to make sure you understood about the gifts," he said, and I could practically hear Chloe whispering the words in his ear. "We know it might have looked a little uneven. That was the word they had settled on. As if it were a slightly lopsided cake, not a chasm of blatant disregard. Barbara is just, well, she's really into all that designer stuff," he explained, his tone condescending, as if he were explaining a complex financial concept to a child. "It's her love language, you know. All that status stuff. You've never been like that, Mom. You're more down to earth. You appreciate the simple things. The sentiment. He said the word as if it were a tangible object, something he had carefully selected and wrapped for me instead of the actual cheap plastic he'd handed over. The sentiment was supposed to be my reward. The implication was clear. I was the good mother, the one who didn't demand such shallow, materialistic things. My goodness was a convenient excuse for his neglect. It was a label he applied to me so he could feel better about prioritizing his mother-in-law's shallow materialism. He was praising me for having low expectations, for being easy to dismiss. "We just knew you'd find a big, flashy bag to be wasteful," he continued, gaining confidence. "And a spa. Mom, you wouldn't know what to do with yourself. You'd be bored. We got you something we knew you'd actually use. Something practical, there was that word again. Practical. The keychain was now not only sentimental, it was practical. It was, in his narrative, the superior gift. It was thoughtful, tailored to my simple, frugal personality. The expensive bag and luxurious spa trip were, by extension, thoughtless gifts for a shallow woman. The mental gymnastics were breathtaking. He had twisted the situation until he was the hero of the story, the deeply intuitive son who knew his mother's humble heart so well. I let him talk. I let him dig the hole deeper and deeper, lining it with every hollow word he could find. I thought about the meaning of practical. Was it practical when I took on extra nursing shifts, working 16 hours on my feet, to pay for his university textbooks? My feet would swell so badly that I'd have to soak them in ice water for an hour before I could sleep. He didn't know that. He just knew the books appeared on his desk. Was it practical when I sold my grandmother's diamond earrings, the only real piece of jewelry I owned, to give him the down payment for his first apartment? He'd complained the kitchen was too small. He never asked where the money came from. He just assumed the bank of Mom was infinitely solvent. Was it practical when my husband, his father, was dying, and I managed Robert's care, the household, my job, and my own shattering grief while Daniel was too swamped with launching his business to visit more than once a week? His father's final months, a sacred, terrible time, were an inconvenience to his schedule. The business, I remembered with a fresh stab of pain, was the one I'd helped fund with Robert's insurance money. The money Robert had wanted me to use to travel. See the world, Ellie, he had whispered, his voice thin as paper. Don't just sit here. But Daniel had a business plan. He had dreams. And I, the practical mother, had invested in my son's future instead of my own. I had poured my husband's legacy into that company, the one that was now funding spa trips for Chloe's mother. I looked at the keychain. World's best mom. The lie of it was so audacious it was almost funny. Mom? You still there? Daniel's voice cut through my thoughts. He sounded impatient. He'd delivered his justification, and was ready for his absolution. Yes, Daniel. I'm here, I said. My voice was different now. The flatness was gone, replaced by something colder, something with the hard, clean edge of forged steel. I understand completely. You've made your priorities perfectly clear, great. I knew you would, he said, relieved. He'd heard my words, but had completely missed my meaning. He mistook my cold fury for acquiescence. You're the best, Mom. Anyway, gotta run, big client meeting. Love you. The line went dead. I stood there in the silence of my kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear. Love? He'd used that word. A word he now wielded like another cheap trinket, something to be tossed out as he rushed away to more important things. I slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. I picked up the keychain. I walked over to the trash can, the one with the foot pedal. I pressed my foot down, the lid popped open, and I dropped the keychain inside. It made a small, unsatisfying noise as it landed on a bed of coffee grounds. The sentiment, it turned out, was disposable. And in that moment, I realized that so was the arrangement that had defined my life for the past 3 decades. The Bank of Mom was officially closing its accounts. The services were being permanently discontinued. And the principal investor was finally, calling in her loan. My life with Robert hadn't been one of luxury, but it had been one of careful planning and quiet partnership. He was a man who believed in foundations. You build on solid ground, Ellie, he'd always say, whether he was talking about the brick patio he was laying in the backyard or the investments he was making for our future. He was a civil engineer, a man who understood stress points and load-bearing walls, both in buildings and in life. When he got sick, that foundation was tested. And after he was gone, I thought the foundation was just me, holding up the world for my son, Daniel. I was wrong. The foundation was something Robert had built for me, and I had forgotten it was even there. For years, my identity had been Daniel's mother. It started when he was small. I was the room parent, the bake sale organizer, the costume sewer. I was the one who sat with him for hours, patiently explaining algebra, until he finally understood. My own dreams, my own career as a head nurse, a position I had loved for its challenges and its deep sense of purpose, slowly took a backseat. When he went to college, a prestigious private university he had his heart set on, our savings weren't quite enough. Robert and I talked it over at our small kitchen table, the numbers laid out before us. Robert, ever the pragmatist, suggested a state school. Daniel, ever the dreamer, was heartbroken. The next day, I went to the bank and withdrew the money from a certificate of deposit that my own parents had left me. It was my rainy day fund, my just in case. I told myself that my son's future was the most important thing I could invest in. Daniel got his prestigious degree, and never once questioned how we suddenly afforded the tuition hikes each year. After Robert passed, the weight of everything fell on me. Daniel was in his late 20s, full of ambition and ideas. He wanted to start his own graphic design agency. He had the talent, he said, but not the capital. He presented me with a business plan full of jargon I didn't understand, words like synergy and brand activation. What I did understand was the figure at the bottom of the page. It was a significant amount of money. It was, in fact, almost the exact amount left from Robert's life insurance policy. "Mom, this is a sure thing," he'd promised, his eyes shining with excitement. "I'll pay you back, with interest, within 5 years. We'll be set. You'll never have to worry about money again." Chloe, his new, serious girlfriend at the time, nodded eagerly beside him. "Daniel is brilliant, Eleanor," she'd said. "You have to believe in him." I looked at my son, the boy I had poured my life into, and I saw his father's ambition in his eyes, but I missed the absence of his father's caution. I missed the absence of his father's character. I wrote him the check. The 5 years came and went. The company was a success, I knew that much. I saw it in the new car he drove, the expensive condo he and Chloe bought, the vacations they took to places I only saw in travel magazines. He never mentioned the money. I never asked. To ask would have felt impolite. It would have felt like I didn't trust him. It would have felt, I told myself, like a mother who wasn't supportive. So I kept quiet. I continued to live in the same small house Robert and I had bought 40 years ago. My furniture was worn but comfortable. My car was old but reliable. I told myself I didn't need fancy things. I told myself my son's success was my reward. But a creeping unease had started to settle in my heart long before the keychain incident. It was in the way Daniel would call me and spend 20 minutes complaining about a client before asking, as an afterthought, how I was doing. It was in the way Chloe would talk to me with a patronizing slowness, as if my age had eroded my intellect, explaining social media trends to me like I was a toddler. They lived in a bright, shiny world of their own making, a world built on a foundation I had provided, and they had started to see me as part of the old, dusty scenery they had left behind. They saw the small house, the old car, the simple life, and they mistook it for my entire net worth. They assumed I had nothing left. They assumed I was nothing left, other than a sentimental obligation to be managed with the least possible effort. After Daniel's phone call, after I had thrown the keychain away, I walked through my quiet house. Every object seemed to tell a story of sacrifice. The chipped coffee mug I drank from every morning, because the new set I'd been given for Christmas, I had regifted to Daniel and Chloe for their housewarming. The threadbare armchair where I had spent countless nights waiting up for him when he was a teenager. The photo on the mantelpiece, me, Robert, and a teenage Daniel, all of us smiling. We looked happy. We were. But we were smiling for different reasons. Daniel was smiling at the bright future ahead of him. Robert and I were smiling because we thought we had provided it. That evening, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't read my book. I just sat in the armchair in the deepening twilight, and let the full weight of my 30-year mistake settle over me. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. But then, underneath the grief and the regret, a new feeling began to stir. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something quieter, colder, and far more powerful. It was the feeling of a foundation shifting back into place. It was the feeling of a load-bearing wall deciding it would no longer carry a weight it was not designed to bear. I had been the silent partner in my son's life for too long. I had been the invisible investor. The quiet benefactor. The bank of Mom. But banks, I reminded myself, are not charities. They have boards of directors. They have policies. And when a debt goes unpaid for too long, they take action. The quiet, down-to-earth, practical mother was about to make a very businesslike decision. And I knew, with a certainty that hummed in my blood, that my son and his condescending wife had no idea what was coming. They had mistaken my love for weakness. They had mistaken my silence for acceptance. They had fundamentally, catastrophically, miscalculated my value. The turning point of a person's life is rarely a thunderclap. It's usually a quiet click, like a lock tumbling into place. For me, that click happened in the dead of night, 2 days after Mother's Day. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the same ceiling I had stared at for 40 years. I had stared at it while worrying about a feverish child, while waiting for a teenager to come home past curfew, while grieving a husband, and while beaming with pride over a son's successes. It was a map of my life, of my love, of my anxieties. But on this night, I wasn't looking at it with nostalgia. I was looking at it as if it were the roof of a cage. The feeling of being undervalued had been a dull, chronic ache for years, something I had learned to live with, like arthritis in a joint. But the Keychain incident had turned it into an acute, stabbing pain. It was the final, incontrovertible piece of evidence in a case that had been building for years. My son and his wife did not respect me. They did not see me. They saw a function, a utility, a resource that had been depleted and was now kept around for sentimental reasons, like a child's bronzed baby shoes. I thought about the phone call with Daniel, his breezy, condescending justifications. "You're more down to earth, Mom." It was an anesthetic he applied to his own conscience. He had to believe I was a simple creature, immune to the sting of disrespect, in order to live with himself. He had to shrink me in his mind so his own stature could feel grander. He had to believe I was content with the crumbs so he could justify keeping the whole loaf for himself. And I, for so long, had played my part. I had nodded and smiled and accepted the crumbs, pretending they were enough, because I thought that was the price of peace. I thought that was what a good mother did. You absorb the small hurts. You overlook the slights. You make yourself smaller so your children can have more space to grow. But my son wasn't growing. He was inflating. And I had been the one pumping the air in. Lying there in the dark, I felt a profound shift inside me. The grief that had been a heavy blanket started to feel more like a weight I could shrug off. The quiet resignation that had been my companion for years began to feel like a self-imposed prison. What was I holding on to? A relationship that was a one-way street. The title of World's Best Mom, as bestowed by a keychain from a gas station. The love of a son who measured his affection in degrees of convenience. I got out of bed. I walked into the living room, the moonlight striping the floor through the blinds. I stood before the mantelpiece and looked at the photo of the three of us. Me, Robert, Daniel. For the first time, I didn't see a happy family. I saw two providers and one beneficiary. I saw two people who had given everything and one who had taken everything and called it love. I picked up the frame, carried it into the kitchen, and gently placed it face down on the counter. It was not an act of anger. It was an act of severance. I was no longer going to define myself by that picture. I was no longer going to live in the past, propping up a fantasy of familial devotion that simply did not exist in reality. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I went about my morning routine, but with a small, significant change. For as long as I could remember, ever since Robert died, I had made a full pot of coffee. It was a habit born of our shared life, a small ritual I had continued out of. I don't know what. Loyalty. Memory. Loneliness. But on this morning, I took out the single-cup filter. I measured out just enough coffee for one. I brewed 1 cup. And as I sat at my kitchen table, sipping the strong, black coffee, I felt not lonely, but self-contained. I was no longer waiting for someone else to share my life. I was no longer preserving a space for someone who wasn't there. I was simply, fully, present in my own company. And it felt like coming home. My decision wasn't born of a desire for revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. This was something different. It was a correction. It was the universe, through me, balancing a set of books that had been dangerously out of whack for far too long. My son had built his shining life on a foundation of my love and my money. He believed that foundation was made of sentiment and endless, unconditional maternal sacrifice. He was about to learn that it was, in fact, built on something far more tangible. Something that came with a deed. Something that came with a lease. Something that came with an expiration date. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the dish drainer. Then I went to the hall closet, to the old, heavy lockbox tucked away on the top shelf behind a stack of winter blankets. The lockbox where Robert had kept all our most important papers. The lockbox I hadn't opened in years. My hands didn't tremble as I retrieved it. My heart didn't pound. I felt a strange and powerful serenity. The era of Eleanor the mother was over. The era of Eleanor the proprietor was about to begin. And my first order of business was to review my assets. The lockbox was heavy, colder than the air in the house. It felt like a piece of the past, dense with the weight of my husband's foresight. I placed it on the dining room table, the same table where Daniel had pitched his business idea to me all those years ago. The irony was not lost on me. I dialed the 3-digit combination, the numbers coming to my fingers as easily as my own birthday. Click. 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 The latch sprang open with a satisfying thud. The air inside smelled of old paper and Robert's faint, lingering scent of cedar and responsibility. Inside were the expected documents, our marriage license, our birth certificates, the title to the house, the title to my car. And underneath them all, in a thick, waterproof folio, was the file I was looking for. The label, in Robert's neat, angular handwriting, read, Commercial Property 124B, Elm Street. My heart didn't leap. It settled. It was the feeling of finding a solid, immovable object in a world that had felt like shifting sand. I opened the folio. Inside was the deed, the original purchase agreement, tax records, and a handwritten note from Robert, tucked into the front flap. I pulled out the note. It was written on his personal stationery, the kind with his engineering firm's logo at the top. It was dated a year before he died. My dearest Ellie, it began. If you are reading this, it means I'm gone, and I hope you are taking care of yourself. I know you. You'll be taking care of everyone else first. So this is my way of taking care of you. I've transferred the Elm Street property solely into your name. It's yours. Not ours, not the family's, yours. It was bought with a small inheritance from my uncle, money that was never part of our joint accounts, and I want it to be your safety net. Your independence. Whether you sell it, rent it, or open a little bookstore like you always talked about, it is your decision and yours alone. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't have your own ground to stand on. This is your ground. Stand firm on it. All my love, Robert. I ran my fingers over his signature, the ink slightly faded but the intent as clear and strong as the day he wrote it. I had forgotten this note. In the fog of grief and the overwhelming responsibility of settling his estate, I had filed it away. I knew I owned the building, of course, but I had always thought of it as ours, another piece of the life we had built together that I was now stewarding for our son's future. I never truly absorbed the meaning of Robert's words, not ours, not the family's, yours. He had seen this coming. He had known my nature. He had known my tendency to give until there was nothing left. And he had built me a lifeboat, a piece of solid ground, and told me it was mine. I took out the deed. There it was, in black and white, legally registered with the county clerk, owner of record, Eleanor Vance, my name. Alone. Then I pulled out the most recent document in the file, the lease agreement. It was dated 8 years ago. It was for the entire ground floor commercial space at 124B, Elm Street. The lessee was Daniel Vance Designs, LLC. I scanned the terms. The rent was a pittance, barely enough to cover the property taxes and the insurance. I had insisted on it at the time. He's just starting out, I'd told the lawyer who drafted it. Let's give him a hand. Daniel had been so grateful, so full of promises. This is amazing, Mom. It saves me a fortune. It's the only way I can make the numbers work. The lease term was for 10 years. It was set to expire in 23 months. But then I saw the clause Robert's lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had insisted on including, a clause I had barely paid attention to at the time. It was a mid-lease review clause. At the 8-year mark, the lessor had the option to terminate the lease with 90 days' notice if the property was to be sold. The 8-year mark was next month. I sat back in my chair, the papers spread out before me like a winning hand in a game I hadn't even known I was playing. 4 years, my son had been operating his successful, high-profit business out of a prime downtown location, while paying rent that wouldn't even cover a studio apartment in the same neighborhood. He wasn't just building his business on my seed money, he was building it on a massive, ongoing subsidy from me. The trips to Aspen, the designer handbags for his mother-in-law, the expensive condo, all of it was being underwritten by my family rate. My generosity wasn't a gift he appreciated, it was a resource he had factored into his business model. It was an exploitable asset. My down-to-earth, practical, non-materialistic nature was saving his company tens of thousands of dollars a year. It wasn't sentiment. It was a line item on his profit and loss statement. The pieces clicked into place with a cold, hard finality. He hadn't just disrespected me with a keychain. He had been systemically, professionally, and profitably disrespecting me for 8 years. He had monetised my love. And that, I decided, was a business model that was about to face a dramatic and immediate market correction. I picked up the phone. I didn't call Daniel. I called the number on the letterhead of the lease agreement. Harrison and Lowe, attorneys at law, a brisk voice answered. Yes, I said, my own voice steady and clear. I'd like to speak with Mr. Harrison. Please tell him Eleanor Vance is calling. The ground beneath my feet was solid, just as Robert had intended. And I was finally ready to stand on it. Mr. Harrison's voice was exactly as I remembered it, a low, reassuring rumble, like a well-maintained engine. He was one of Robert's oldest friends, a man who valued loyalty and integrity above all else. He had handled Robert's will with a gentle competence that had been a great comfort to me. Eleanor. How wonderful to hear from you, he said, his tone warm, but immediately sensing this wasn't just a social call. It's been too long. Is everything all right? I took a deep breath. Everything is about to be, Arthur, I said. I need your professional services. I'm sitting here with the file for 124B, Elm Street. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then a low chuckle. Ah, he said. Robert's Eleanor Fund. I always wondered when you'd decide to open the portfolio. He knew. Of course, he knew. He was the one who had drafted the documents, who had likely counseled Robert on the very wording of the note. He was the ally I didn't even realize I had. This small confirmation, this validation from a man I respected, erased any lingering doubt I might have had. I wasn't being vindictive. I was being prudent. I was acting as the sole director of my own life, as Robert had intended. I want to sell it, Arthur, I said, the words feeling clean and decisive in my mouth. As soon as possible. I see, he said. There was no judgment in his voice, only a calm professionalism. And what about the tenant? Young Daniel's business, isn't it? Yes, I said. His lease has a termination clause. At the 8-year mark. That's next month. I remember it well, Arthur said. Robert was very specific about that clause. He said, a man who can't stand on his own 2 feet after 8 years in business doesn't deserve the ladder. Is Daniel aware of this? Daniel is aware of very little, Arthur, I replied, a hint of ice in my voice. He believes the building is his birthright, and my support is his permanent entitlement. He has been remiss in showing his gratitude. He has a mother-in-law who receives designer handbags and spa weekends. On the same day, I received a plastic keychain. I hadn't intended to share that detail, but it came out, the raw, humiliating truth of it. Arthur was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, the warmth in his voice was fused with a cold resolve. Eleanor, he said, his voice firm. Robert would be spinning in his grave. Not because you're selling the building, but because you felt for 1 second that you shouldn't. This is exactly why he set it up this way. He knew his son. And he knew you. Consider it done. The relief was a physical sensation, like a heavy cloak sliding from my shoulders. I wasn't a crazy, bitter old woman. I was a woman with a legitimate grievance and a legal right to act. I wasn't destroying my family. I was saving myself from a dynamic that was destroying me. Over the next 2 weeks, Arthur and I worked with quiet efficiency. He was a master of his craft. He contacted a commercial real estate agent he trusted, a discreet professional named Mrs. Gable, who came to my house for our meetings instead of making me come to her office. She assessed the property, the market, and the potential for a quick sale. The building, she informed me, was in a rapidly gentrifying area. Its market value was nearly triple what Robert had paid for it. The rent Daniel was paying was, in her professional opinion, criminally low. She had a list of potential buyers, investment groups, who were hungry for property in that exact block. While she prepared to list the property, Arthur drafted the official notice. It was a masterpiece of dispassionate legal prose. It cited the specific clause in the lease agreement. It stated my intention to sell the property. It gave Daniel and his company 90 days to vacate the premises. There were no emotional words, no accusations, no mention of keychains or mothers-in-law. It was just business. Cold, hard, and irrefutable. The day the notice was ready, I went to Arthur's office to sign it. The office was what you'd expect: dark wood, leather-bound books, a faint smell of old paper and justice. Arthur laid the document on his wide mahogany desk. He handed me a heavy, expensive-looking pen. Are you sure, Eleanor? He asked, his eyes kind. Once you sign this, the bell can't be unrung. I looked at the pen in my hand. I thought of the designer handbag. I thought of the spa trip. I thought of my husband's last wishes. I thought of 30 years of being the practical one, the one who didn't need or want for anything. I thought of the cheap clack of the keychain on the restaurant table. I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life, Arthur, I said. I signed my name. Eleanor Vance. Not Mom, not Daniel's mother, just my name. A name that was on a deed, a name that was on a legal notice, a name that was finally, after all these years, my own. Arthur placed the signed document into a crisp envelope. I'll have it delivered by certified courier to his office this afternoon, he said. He'll have to sign for it himself. There will be no ambiguity, I nodded. I stood up, feeling taller than I had in years. I had taken no joy in the act, but I felt a profound sense of rightness, of balance being restored to the universe. As I left his office, I felt the sun on my face. It was a beautiful day. The world seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. I had spent so long living in the shadow of my son's life that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand in my own light. I went home, brewed a single cup of coffee, and sat in my garden, waiting for the phone to ring. I knew it wouldn't be long. The quietest woman in the room had finally spoken, and her voice was a legally binding document. The first call came 3 hours later. The caller ID flashed Daniel. I let it ring 4 times, then answered, my voice deliberately calm and neutral. Hello, Daniel, Mom. What is this? He sounded confused, annoyed, like he'd received a parking ticket he didn't deserve. I just had some guy in a uniform hand me a legal envelope. From a lawyer. Harrison and Lowe. What's going on? The carefully constructed nonchalance in my voice was my shield and my sword. It's exactly what it says it is, Daniel. It's a notice of lease termination. I've decided to sell the building on Elm Street. There was a stunned silence on the other end. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, the pieces refusing to fit into the picture of the world he had built. In his world, I was a passive entity, a benevolent landlord who existed solely for his benefit. A mother. Not a property owner with agency. Sell the building, he finally sputtered, his voice rising in disbelief. What are you talking about? You can't sell the building. That's my office. My company is there, it's my building, Daniel, I said, my voice unwavering. And I have chosen to sell it. The lease agreement, which you signed, gives me that right. You have 90 days to find a new location. This is insane, he shouted, the confusion now morphing into panic. Where am I supposed to go? Do you know what commercial rent is like downtown? This will ruin me. Why are you doing this? I refused to take the bait. I would not get into an argument about keychains or hurt feelings. This was not about emotion. This was about a contract. My reasons are my own, I said coolly. This is a business decision. I suggest you speak to your own lawyer if you have questions about the terms of the lease. Mr. Harrison has a copy of everything, a business decision, he echoed, his voice dripping with incredulous rage. You're my mother. We don't make business decisions. We're family. It was breathtaking. The very concept of family he had so casually disregarded on Mother's Day was now his primary legal argument. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Family is a bond of mutual respect, Daniel, I said, the words as cold and sharp as ice shards. You have made it clear that you see our relationship as a series of transactions. I have simply decided to formalize the arrangement. I have a meeting with a realtor tomorrow. I have to go. I hung up the phone before he could respond. My hand was perfectly steady. My heart was calm. For the first time, I was the one ending the conversation. I was the one setting the terms. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Chloe. The tone was a masterclass in manipulative sympathy. Eleanor, Daniel just told me what's happening and I am so worried about you. This is so unlike you. Are you feeling all right? Have you been to a doctor lately? We are concerned you're not thinking clearly and someone might be taking advantage of you. Please call us. We love you. The condescension was palpable. They weren't accusing me of being malicious, they were accusing me of being senile. It was a classic tactic: if you can't win the argument, declare your opponent mentally incompetent. They couldn't conceive of me making a rational decision that didn't benefit them, so the only possible explanation was that I had lost my mind. I deleted the text without replying. The next day, the panicked calls started again. This time, Daniel's tone had shifted from outrage to a desperate, wheedling plea. "Mom, okay, look, I'm sorry," he began, the apology sounding forced and insincere. "If this is about Mother's Day, I'm sorry. The keychain was stupid. It was a mistake. Chloe and I will buy you a bag. We'll take you to a spa. Just name it. But you can't do this. This is my livelihood. It's everything Dad and you wanted for me." The audacity of invoking his father's name was a new low. "What your father wanted, Daniel," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "was for me to have my own ground to stand on. He also believed a man should be able to stand on his own 2 feet. You have had 8 years of subsidized living. The training wheels are coming off." "Training wheels? I built this company from nothing," he yelled. "With a significant interest-free loan from your mother, and a lease that was a fraction of the market rate," I countered, my memory suddenly crystal clear. "You didn't build it from nothing, Daniel. You built it from a foundation that I laid for you. A foundation you took for granted." There was another sputtering silence. He had no response to that. Facts were a language he was not fluent in. The final stage of his panic set in a week later. It was another call, but this time his voice was laced with a sense of ugly, thwarted entitlement. "I've spoken to a lawyer," he snarled. "He said you can't do this. That building is a family asset. It's part of my inheritance. You're just the steward of it. You can't just sell it out from under me." "Then I suggest you get a new lawyer, Daniel," I said, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing this conversation from a great distance. "Because Mr. Harrison, who happens to be an excellent lawyer, has a copy of the deed. And it has only one name on it. Mine. It was never a family asset. It was my asset. And you, of all people, should understand the importance of protecting one's assets." I could hear Chloe in the background now, her voice a frantic whisper. "Tell her we'll pay more rent. Tell her we'll double it." Daniel's voice came back on the line, strained. "Mom, look. We can renegotiate the lease. We'll pay you proper market rate. We can work this out. Don't throw everything away over a misunderstanding." It was the ultimate concession, the one thing he thought would move me. Money. He was finally offering to pay me what he should have been paying all along. But it was too late. This was never about the money. It was about the value. And my value was no longer for sale, certainly not to him. "The building is already being listed, Daniel," I said calmly. "Mrs. Gable has a showing this afternoon. It's out of my hands now," and then I did something I had never done before. I hung up on my screaming, pleading, panicking son. And then, I blocked his number. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not at my kitchen table. They wouldn't dare enter my home now, it had ceased to be their territory. Instead, it was on neutral ground, in the sterile, impersonal conference room of Mr. Harrison's law office. They had demanded the meeting, a last-ditch effort to appeal to, what? My maternal instinct. My supposed senility. My pity. I wasn't sure what they were hoping for, but I knew what they were going to get, the truth, served cold. I arrived 10 minutes early, calm and composed. I wore a simple, well-tailored navy blue dress, one I had bought myself the week before. Mr. Harrison greeted me with a respectful nod and led me to the conference room. He had a pitcher of ice water and 3 glasses on the polished mahogany table. He also had a single, slim file folder placed squarely in front of my seat. "They are in the waiting room," he said quietly. "Are you ready, Eleanor?" I looked at him, my oldest and newest friend. "I've been ready for 30 years, Arthur," I said. He smiled faintly and left to retrieve them. Daniel and Chloe entered the room like actors walking onto a hostile stage. Daniel's face was a blotchy mess of anger and desperation. His expensive suit looked rumpled, as if he'd been sleeping in it. Chloe was pale, her usually perfect makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She attempted a weak, tremulous smile in my direction, a pathetic attempt at her old manipulative charm. I did not return it. I simply watched them, my expression unreadable. They sat opposite me, a vast expanse of polished wood between us. The silence was thick and heavy. Daniel, as usual, broke it first, unable to stand not being in control. "Mom," he began, his voice trying for a tone of wounded reason. "We need to stop this madness." "This isn't you, oh, but it is, Daniel," I replied, my voice quiet, but carrying easily in the silent room. "This is precisely me. This is the me you never bothered to see," Chloe jumped in, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Eleanor, we are just so worried. We think you're under some kind of stress. Maybe you're lonely since Dad. We think you should reconsider. For the sake of the family. I asked, allowing the question to hang in the air. I leaned forward slightly, my hands folded calmly on the table. "Let's talk about the family, Chloe. Is family what you call it when you and your mother enjoy designer handbags and spa weekends, while the woman whose money funded the business that paid for those gifts receives a keychain? Is that the family you are so concerned about preserving?" Chloe flinched as if I'd slapped her. Her face flushed a deep, ugly red. She had no answer. Daniel surged forward. "This isn't about a stupid keychain," he roared, slamming his hand on the table. The water glasses rattled. Mr. Harrison, who had re-entered and was standing quietly by the door, took a half-step forward, but I held up a hand to stop him. "It was never about the keychain, Daniel," I said, my voice never rising. "The keychain was just the invoice. It was the summary of a long and detailed accounting of my worth in your eyes. It was a $5 trinket that told me everything I needed to know." I opened the slim file folder in front of me. Inside were 2 documents. I slid the first one across the table towards them. It was a copy of the bank statement showing the wire transfer from my personal account to his, the seed money for his business. "Do you remember this?" I asked. "This was from your father's life insurance. The money he wanted me to use to travel the world. Instead, I invested it in you." I slid the second document across the table. It was a 1-page analysis Mrs. Gable had prepared, showing the market rental rate for 124B, Elm Street for the past 8 years, versus the rent he had actually paid. The difference, calculated at the bottom, was a staggering 6-figure number. "And do you see this?" I continued. "This is the subsidy you have been receiving for 8 years. This is the family rate. This is the money that paid for your condo, your car, your vacations, your wife's expensive tastes. It seems to me, family has been a very profitable business for you, Daniel." He stared at the papers, his face ashen. The numbers didn't lie. His narrative of the self-made man, the brilliant entrepreneur, was dissolving in the face of hard, cold facts. He was a subsidized entity, a trust fund kid who hadn't even known he had a trust fund. I was going to pay you back," he stammered, his voice losing all its bluster. "I always intended to." "Intentions don't balance a ledger, Daniel," I said. "And they certainly don't excuse 2 decades of taking someone for granted. You didn't see a mother who was sacrificing for you. You saw a resource you could exploit. You and your wife, I added, my gaze shifting to Chloe, who shrank back in her chair, saw a simple, down-to-earth old woman who was easy to manage, easy to dismiss, and easy to insult with a cheap piece of plastic while you lavished luxuries on others. You underestimated me. You both did. And that was your single most expensive mistake. I leaned back in my chair. I had said everything I needed to say. There was no anger left, just a vast, quiet emptiness where my illusions used to be. The building is in contract, I said flatly. The sale closes in 60 days. The notice stands. You have 90 days to vacate the premises. Mr. Harrison will be happy to forward all communications to your lawyer. This meeting is over. Daniel looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. It was the look of a child who had finally, truly, understood that the consequences were real. He opened his mouth to plead, to argue, to say something, anything. But for the first time in his life, no words came out. He was bankrupt, not just financially, but morally. He had nothing left to say. I stood up, smoothed down my dress, and picked up my purse. I gave Chloe one last, lingering look. I hope you enjoy your mother's new handbag, I said. Then I turned and walked out of the room, leaving my son and his wife sitting in the ruins of the world they had built. I didn't look back. Mr. Harrison held the door for me, and as I stepped out into the hallway, I felt the unmistakable sensation of a cage door swinging open. I was free. The silence in the aftermath was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The panicked calls and manipulative texts had ceased. The angry demands and desperate pleadings were gone. There was just peace. A profound and enveloping quiet that settled over my little house like a soft blanket. For the first few days, I did almost nothing. I slept late. I sat in my garden and listened to the birds. I read books that had been gathering dust on my shelves for years. I was recalibrating my own existence, learning to live in a world that wasn't defined by the needs and demands of my son. It felt like learning to breathe after being underwater for a very long time. Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Gable handled everything. The sale of the building went through without a hitch, to an investment group that paid 20% over the asking price. When Mr. Harrison called to tell me the funds had been transferred to an account he had set up for me, the number he quoted was so large it seemed abstract, unreal. It was a life-changing amount of money. But the money wasn't the point. I had never done this for the money. I had done it for the principle. The money was just a byproduct of my own liberation. The day the 90-day notice expired, I drove downtown. I parked across the street from 124B, Elm Street. There was a large moving truck parked outside. Men were hauling out office furniture, computers, and boxes. I saw Daniel for a brief moment, directing the movers. He looked tired and diminished. He had lost weight. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by jeans and a polo shirt. He looked like just another man, struggling to manage a difficult day. I felt nothing. Not pity, not triumph, not even a flicker of maternal concern. I was simply an observer watching a scene unfold. He was no longer my responsibility. His struggles were no longer my burdens to carry. He had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. I watched for about 10 minutes, then I started my car and drove away. I didn't drive home. I drove to the travel agency downtown. I walked in and told the woman behind the desk that I wanted to book a trip. "Where would you like to go?" she asked, her fingers poised over the keyboard. I thought of my husband's words. "See the world, Ellie." I thought of the 30 years I had put that dream on hold. "Everywhere," I said with a small smile. I started with a one-way ticket to Florence, Italy. I had always dreamed of seeing the art, of drinking wine in a small piazza, of learning to make pasta from scratch. For so long, it had been a fantasy, a someday that I never truly believed would come. 2 weeks later, I was there. I sold my house, the house of memories and sacrifices, to a lovely young family just starting out. I put most of my furniture in storage, keeping only a few treasured pieces from my life with Robert. I packed one large suitcase and 2 smaller ones, and took a taxi to the airport. I didn't tell Daniel or Chloe where I was going. I left no forwarding address. My only point of contact with my old life was Mr. Harrison. He had my email address and instructions to only contact me in a true emergency. I spent 3 months in Italy. I rented a small, sun-drenched apartment with a balcony overlooking a bustling street. I learned to speak broken, but passable Italian. I took cooking classes. I visited every museum and art gallery I could find. I made friends with the old woman who ran the bakery on the corner. I drank cappuccinos in the morning and red wine in the evening. For the first time in my adult life, my days belonged completely to me. I wasn't a mother, a wife, a nurse, or a landlord. I was just Eleanor. And Eleanor, it turned out, was a woman who was curious, adventurous, and perfectly happy in her own company. From Italy, I went to the south of France. I walked along the beaches of Nice and explored the lavender fields of Provence. Then I went to Greece and sailed through the islands, the blue of the Aegean Sea so bright it hurt my eyes. I sent postcards to Mr. Harrison, but to no one else. I was building a new life, one memory at a time, on a foundation that was mine and mine alone. One evening, I was sitting on my balcony in a small village on the coast of Crete, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I had a glass of local wine in my hand, and a plate of olives and cheese on the table beside me. The air was warm, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves on the shore below. And I realized, with a profound sense of peace, that I was happy. Truly, deeply happy. It wasn't a loud, triumphant happiness, but a quiet, steady contentment that seemed to emanate from my very core. I had lost a son, but I had found myself. And it was, by far, the best investment I had ever made. The keychain had been a symbol of my perceived worthlessness. But my new life, this life of freedom and discovery, was the symbol of my true, reclaimed value. I had finally, after all these years, seen the world. And in doing so, I had found my own place in it. So, here I am. I am speaking to you now from a small, sunny apartment in Lisbon, Portugal. Outside my window, I can hear the mournful, beautiful sound of a fado singer in a nearby cafe, and the rattling of the old yellow tram as it makes its way up the steep, cobbled streets. It's a life I never could have imagined for myself just a year ago. A life I had to fight for, not by shouting, but by being quiet, not by demanding, but by withdrawing. It's funny how we measure value. For so long, I measured my worth by the depth of my sacrifice. I thought that the more I gave, the more I emptied myself for my family, the more valuable I was. I believed that love was a currency of self-denial. I was wrong. True value isn't about what you are willing to give away, it's about what you refuse to surrender. Your dignity. Your self-respect. Your right to be seen and valued as a whole person, not just a role you play in someone else's life. My son and his wife saw me as a utility. A fixture from their past that provided a service. When the service was no longer needed, they kept the fixture around out of a vague sense of obligation, dusting it off once a year with a cheap, meaningless gesture. They didn't count on the fixture having its own power source. They didn't count on the fixture being able to unplug itself and walk away. I don't know what happened to Daniel and Chloe. I haven't asked, and I have no desire to know. Their story is no longer my story. I hope he learned something about consequences, about respect, about the true cost of things. But his lessons are his own to learn. My curriculum is complete. My role as his teacher is over. My only role now is to be the protagonist of my own story. A story that is still being written, every day, in a new city, with a new experience. My husband Robert wanted me to have my own ground to stand on. For years, I thought that ground was a piece of property, a financial asset. But I've learned that the ground he was talking about was inside of me all along. It was the bedrock of my own self-worth. The legal battles, the financial maneuvers, those were just the tools I used to clear away all the debris that others had piled on top of it. Once it was cleared, I found that my foundation was solid, and I could build any life I wanted upon it. I wanted to share this story with you because I know I am not the only one. I know there are so many of you out there, especially women of my generation, who have been taught to be the foundation for everyone else, to be the quiet support system that asks for nothing in return. You are the invisible architects of your family's successes, and you are too often left living in the basement of the very house you helped build. So I ask you, what ground do you need to reclaim? What quiet strength inside you have you forgotten about? It doesn't have to be a building or a secret bank account. It can be a talent you've set aside, a dream you've deferred, a friendship you've neglected. It can be the simple, revolutionary act of saying no, of brewing a single cup of coffee, of taking yourself out to dinner, of buying yourself the designer handbag, literally or metaphorically. Your worth is not determined by the people who take you for granted. It is determined by you. You set the price. You own the deed to your own life. Never let anyone offer you a keychain when you deserve the world. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And please, tell me your stories in the comments below. Tell me about a time you had to reclaim your own value. These stories are our power. They are our collective deed. Let's stand on this ground together.